And perhaps this is the expression that Joe Biden had when he looked at the recent reporting that my next guest was just delivered a vice presidential paperwork vetting from the Trump campaign. Let's not beat around the bush or not talk about the elephant in the room, ladies and gentlemen. The elephant on the ticket, the GOP ticket, will be Donald Trump at the top. Will the next name followed be Marco Rubio? Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, will be our first question to Senator Marco Rubio, who joins us live now. Senator, how are you today? Thank you so much for joining our program. Congratulations. It's been a big week.
Well, I mean, every week's a big week these days in our country, unfortunately, in some cases. But yeah, let's see what next week brings.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So I want to begin by saying, your name, again, hit the news feeds, and it's been a regular occurrence for the last couple of months. A lot of little birdies coming on our program, talking you up. And I suppose, want to get your response to the news about you being vetted this week. Any updates there?
Yeah, I don't have any update on that. I mean, I keep reading these articles. I imagine, between now and the day that President Trump picks somebody, you'll see more and more of these. But I've been through this once before, back in 2012. So I would just tell you the best advice I can give everybody is there's going to be a vice presidential pick. It's going to be made by one person on the planet. His name is Donald J. Trump. And I would leave it to them to sort of make any comments. And if it isn't coming from them directly, I wouldn't believe it. It's not like the mainstream media in America or NBC News or anybody else has special connections or insight into that campaign. So look, they're going to make a great choice. I think the more important thing that I point to is if you look at the list of people, like who is that comparable list in the Democrat Party, right? They don't have one. I mean, you just think about, there's 8 people out there that you would look at and say, oh yeah, they could be president, they could be vice president. That's the number one qualification for it. I mean, the Democrats, if Joe Biden were to somehow try to sit in some imaginary chair, hypothetically, and fall and not be able to be president, who would take the place on the ballot people keep talking about? Is it Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom, who's destroyed a once great state? I mean, who is we've got like 12 people out there that could serve in that role as vice president. So I think it's a blessing as a Republican to have so many good people, but I leave it to the Trump camp. I'm not trying to be evasive. It's just that it's their process. And it's his decision. So I'll let them talk about that.
Of course, and to be quite frank, Senator, we get tired of asking the questions because we know there is one man who makes this decision, and it'll be made around convention time, is what we've been told. And so you're just, especially with the news cycle this week, you're deigned to ask about it. And I guess the other question that regularly comes up would be a constitutional one about residency, and how would that work? But apparently your office has an answer on that.
Well, no, I mean, the answer, is basically, Florida, for example, if you pick 2 people from Florida because he's a Florida resident, you can't, Florida's electors would not be able to vote 2 people from Florida, and so like Dick Cheney had that issue because he lived in Texas, and so he moved to Wyoming. And so Hillary Clinton moved to New York. She never even lived in New York to be senator there, right? So there's politicians have been doing that for time to time. It's actually a relic of I probably know more about this just because I've been asked about it so many times than I ever thought I would know. But the key to that is that, basically somebody on January 7th or whatever the day is in 2025, some Democrat could stand up and challenge the electors from Florida unless one of those 2 people, probably, but I guarantee you there will be challenges when Donald Trump wins, and it won't just be on that. I mean, there are some Democrats already openly saying that he's an insurrectionist and he shouldn't be allowed to stand for office, and those votes should be disqualified. Same people tried to get him kicked off the ballot in a couple states. So I think that's a resolvable issue, but I don't think that's going to be a factor in who he picks. And like I said, I don't know who he's going to pick. I don't think anybody on earth knows who he's going to pick except him. It's his decision to make, and he'll make a good one. I'm pretty sure that because he's got a lot of good people to pick from.
That's right. You bring up such an interesting point about there being no bench on the left. And it just, since we're on this topic, and I want to move to a bunch of other news, but since we're on this topic, there doesn't seem to be anybody that really piques any interest or even has any type of intellectual stimulation going on the left. However, were this pick to be you, you'd have to sit across from somebody in a vice presidential debate who would potentially say a comment like this to you.
When we talk about our children, I know for this group, we all believe that when we talk about the children of the community, they are the children of the community.
They are the children of the community, Marco. I think it's a profound statement. It's about as profound as this. Just one final nugget of wisdom that you may hear at a vice presidential debate right across from you.
We all watched the television coverage of just yesterday. That's on top of everything else that we know and don't know yet, based on what we've just been able to see. And because we've seen it or not doesn't mean it hasn't happened. But just limited to what we have seen.
So how would you, Senator, be able to, raconteur with such wit?
But it'll be hard to address what's been addressed and which has been said and has been said now, whether it's been said or not. So, it'll be difficult to address the unaddressable in an addressable way. And we'll have to work on that, I guess. Is that pretty good?
That was great. I feel like it'd be a very Austin Powers like mind explosion, because if you hit Kamala Harris with a rhetorical flourish like that, I think the circuits would all fry. I think we'd and
people would just say, okay, switch the channel. So, but I think your broader point about the bench, look, it was like we've always had people in America that want to higher taxes, more government. I mean, that's the traditional 80s, even 90s liberalism versus conservatism. And that's an ideological debate, and it happens all over the world, and it's happened in this country. But what's happened over the last 20 or 30 years, I always assumed, right up until very recently, that everybody agreed this was a great and fantastic country. Our history isn't perfect. It's just better than anybody else's. It's extraordinary. Like there's no comparison. There's no comparison to America in the history of mankind. 5,500 years of recorded human history. Okay, nothing like it when you add it all together. It's very special. And I assumed everybody sort of agreed on that premise. And yes, there were some Marxists on the far left that argued America was this terrible place that needed to be rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt, but that was on the fringes. And I think what perhaps we didn't all, certainly it took me, to my surprise, time to fully realize is how embedded in the mainstream that fringe idea had become. Now, not always openly, but how. And so what happens is that's now become, maybe not, it's certainly, I don't think it's the majority of Democratic voters, but I think it's certainly the majority of people with power and influence in the Democratic Party, seeing it play out, whether it's in Hamas or everything else. And so if you want to rise in Democratic politics, you must come from that line of thinking, or at least be acceptable to them. And I think that knocks out a lot of people that could potentially be a candidate that appeals to the broader group of Americans that have things like common sense and love America. And so I think it's really become very difficult for someone in the Democratic Party to rise unless they come from that universe. In the case of Joe Biden, that's not been his history. But I think actually Joe Biden is the perfect president for people that view America as evil and needs to be dismantled, because he has no political base, and clearly, he's in rapid decline. So it's perfect for them, because then, the less powerful, the less on top of it the president is, the more the people underneath him at the career bureaucracy and staff and everybody else is making the decisions, the more powerful they become. And so he's had to populate his White House and his administration with people from this fringe that now become the mainstream on the left. And to them, he's perfect. He's the perfect cutout. I mean, because they don't have to worry about a president saying, "Hey guys, maybe this goes too far." He's just going to read whatever index card they hand him, right down to the instructions, like pause.
So it does, whenever we do debate shows, it does cause us to pause and reset the table. And we just did this last night with a Piers Morgan hit with a bunch of panel libs. Like, this isn't normal, actually. And what's the idea that you're going to put a leading presidential candidate in prison 5 months before the election? That's no tradition that anybody shares in this country. For 250 years, not Republican, Democrat, Green Party, or Independent, nobody's ever done that. And that's actually a tradition that's totally foreign to our system, which is Stalinism and Marxism, where you lock up your political opponents out of sheer brunt force of power and your inability or lack of desire to allow the will of the people. And you and your family have a history with that in Cuba, and so many people in the state of Florida and potentially around the country have a history with that style of totalitarianism and Stalinism. And I have a two-part question for you. One, how would you reach those people? Because those people don't want that system here. I think that's like there's a very clear binary, Senator. You speak with any immigrant, whether it's first or third generation, they don't want that system to come to America. Yet here we are. And then two, how do you encourage your Republican colleagues to stop having these good faith arguments on the merits of this, because there is like a moment where you kind of pull the switch and you're like, no, what you've done is not American.
Yeah. So these are political trials, right? And so when you come from countries, you were born in a country, raised in a country, fled a country that had political trials, you recognize them. You recognize them before the people in politics recognize it. So I don't think we need to reach them as much as we just need to be there for them to reach us, because I think people have come to that conclusion. It is them. It is from them that I have gotten this idea that this is comparable, not just to what you saw in Cuba after Fidel Castro took over, what you saw in the Soviet Union for a long time, but what you see in many other parts of the world where political trials are normal, they're accepted. I mean, one of the reasons, I say this to you as someone who's very involved in, for example, the Western Hemisphere, one of the reasons why so many of the people who get elected president in these countries do everything possible to stay in power, like, for example, try to change the Constitution so they can run for re-election, is because they know that once you're out of power, what usually happens to former presidents in those countries or the other side takes over is not that you go open a library or go on a speaking tour. It's that you get put on trial and go to jail, so they don't want to leave power. So political show trials are very common in dysfunctional republics and democracies around the world, and people who come from those countries recognize it and they don't like it. And there's no other way to describe what's happened here. In terms of what you just said about this is not being normal, look, we can talk about them crossing the line, but I think we have to understand at the core of it. When Obama gets elected in 2008, reelected in 2012, these people who want to dismantle the country, they legitimately believe that this whole notion that America is exceptional and great is a myth. It's a myth. In fact, America needs to be fundamentally dismantled and rebuilt into something else. Those people believed that finally they had the majority they needed in American politics to put their plans in action. And they begin waging war on every aspect of our traditional life. And then Donald Trump happens, and they go into complete meltdown mode. And you can see it almost from the minute he takes office. I remember, right after he's elected, I mean, there's these women that look like, time travelers from the 60s, images of them in the streets screaming, men walking around with, on these weird signs saying obnoxious things and so forth. Just it seemed almost unnatural. You could tell almost from the beginning there was something else behind this. And what was behind it is Donald Trump interrupted and stood in the way of what they thought was now an inevitable and irreversible permanent change in our demographics, in our politics, and therefore in our direction. And now they will do anything. There is nothing they will not do to keep him from running for office. And what they're counting on is Republicans who basically want to continue to be considered good, decent people, normal Republicans, as they like to say. There are a lot of people that want to keep that membership card to that club. And that's what they're counting on. But the bottom line here is, and I think the president said it really well the other night. I think it was Sean Hannity's show asked him, do you plan to go after them? He says, no, I don't. This has to stop. I think that's exactly the right answer. This has to stop. They are the ones that have unleashed lawsuits to bankrupt him, 4 indictments to try to put him away, force him to stand trial before a judge that donated money to Joe Biden into a Stop Republican, Stop Trump effort. I mean, that is a de facto, you must get off the case almost anywhere. This guy has not one case, but multiple cases involving Trump before him, and then give these ridiculous jury instructions. So we can get into the micro of how unfair that trial was. But I think if you step back and look at the big picture, from going to court to getting him kicked off the ballots, getting him, indicted 4 times, suing him, impeaching him twice, the hoax about him having been coordinating with the Kremlin to become an illegitimate president that took over. You just go back on the court. It's unprecedented. No political figure in American history has ever faced that barrage of using the Congress, the courts, the media to target them and to prevent Americans from being able to elect them president of the United States. So I think we have to understand we're operating in a very different environment now with people and against people who will stop at nothing to get back on, to get their project to dismantle and remake America back on track. They will stop at nothing.
So there's a final question here, and there does seem to be real good momentum heading into the general election. I think that Donald Trump's going to do excellent in the CNN debate. I think that things are going to solidify, and I think that Donald Trump could win 100 electoral votes. There needs, however, to be some type of reckoning with the lies that have been told to the American public. Just this week, we saw the FBI come forward and say, yeah, of course Hunter Biden's laptop's real. Yet the intelligence community got 51 experts coordinated by our Secretary of State to say it's not, and to lie to us. And many would call that election meddling in 2020 and election rigging. But that was done through the intel agencies. And you are a leader on the Intelligence Select Committee in the Senate. And there's been so many circumstances like that. There's so many examples of the intelligence agencies being weaponized against us, the American people. Could you speak to the broader? Could you just speak quickly to what can and should happen in the lead up to the election, and then perhaps afterwards for reform?
Okay, a couple, and it's actually worse than that. Okay, actually, the intelligence community, the actual official intelligence community at that time, was run by John Ratcliffe, and they basically came out and said, "I don't know what these people are talking about." The media and the public largely ignored them and instead relied on 50 former intelligence officials who basically take the fact that they were once in government and then use that, and the fact that they still have clearances, which in my mind need to be revoked, because to me what they did was abuse those clearances to basically imply. I mean, the worst thing you can say is imply to people, I know something I can't tell you, but believe me, it's really bad. Okay? It's the worst thing you can do because you can't defend yourself against it. That's what these guys did. So you have 50 former intelligence officials, not current, so you couldn't fire them, who basically used the credibility or the standing that former title gave them to say to the American people, this stuff looks classic disinformation, Russian disinformation oppo. This laptop must be fake. Okay, and there's a great video out. I think it was released a couple of days ago that goes through a bunch of this. The worst part about it, however, is that on the basis of these formers, despite the official DNI, the one who was in office at the time, saying this is not true, the media, Twitter, Facebook, and others as well, decided to black the story out. To the extent they talked about it, it was disinformation. And in many cases, if you posted or reposted the New York Post story, they would shut down your account or they would block the viewers from seeing it. So there was an active effort to keep that information from becoming widespread in the minds of Americans. And to the extent that it leaked out, it was defined on the basis of these experts. So it's even worse because they basically said, we believe the formers, not the current, because the current work for Trump and they're liars. I make this point everywhere. I don't know, because unfortunately, in America, people have a First Amendment right to say things that aren't true in the political sphere. They do it all the time. But I did this in a public hearing the other day. I do it all the time in our closed hearings. I tell the intelligence agencies repeatedly, the biggest threat to our intelligence agencies is the loss of credibility in the minds of a substantial percentage of Americans because of the actions of people that leave the agencies, go out and become political activists by abusing their title. Clapper, Brennan, all these guys that are there, and then they leave, and lower level people, and then they abuse it. They go out and abuse it, and so now everybody, believes. And you know who it's really unfair to as well? These people, operators that are out there all over the world, working at these agencies and embassies and tough places, doing work. They don't care about any of this. This is not their thing. They're out there, like in many cases, frustrated. They're not allowed to do more because they want to protect us against our enemies. But there's another group of people that sort of rise to the leadership of these agencies, in many cases appointed, they're not even career, who are thinking to themselves, I need to be popular among the right group of people so that when I leave, I'll get put on a corporate board. I'll be asked to be on the faculty somewhere and teach. I can monetize my years in service. And one of the things that gets you entry into that club nowadays is to be anti-Trump and to say he's going to be a dictator, he's a threat, he's a Russian asset. So it's very damaging. Very, very damaging what they did, apart from being outrageous. And yes, I think that collusion between these formers, who were liars, and the media to keep that story from the American people in the month preceding the election interfered and influenced the outcome of the election. If that story had been widespread, I think you could argue thousands and thousands of people would have voted very differently. The election may not even have been very close, but we'll never know because they worked to keep that from them.
Yes. We really hope that there's nothing getting cooked up for the next 5 months. It seems like all the trend lines are going in your direction. And I guess as a closing note here, do you see the problems with America as spiritual? Do you see it more as spiritual than political?
I think, well, I don't know what you mean by spiritual. I think what you're saying is, I think at the core, look, there are a lot of people are going to listen. Let me separate it this way. There are a lot of people that are going to vote because life was better under Trump. They may love the way he used to speak. They may not like some of the things he says, but they say to themselves, when he was president, I had more money left over at the end of the month. The world and our country was safer, and America was respected, around the world. And today, all three of those things have been rapid decline. I think that's at the central core of how many people are going to vote. I think at the core of the election is the bigger question about our identity as a nation. Are we truly, as some of these people argue, this inherently evil country founded on racism and genocide and bigotry and xenophobia? Or are we this greatest nation in the history of the world that's worth not just preserving, but expanding to even higher greatness and to continue the work of progress, which has been the American experiment? That's the core issue of our campaign. Now, embedded in this challenge is that because of some of this craziness and lack of common sense, we have some deep cultural problems in our country, which government can't solve. I mean, without strong families, without strong communities, without a clear sense of right and wrong and good and bad, we got big problems. You can make something illegal, but unless it's and that's why, unless it's instilled at a young age. And so when you see things like, we have big problems in this country, but America remains, by all historical comparisons, a pretty prosperous and free place for the average everyday person. We have 13 or 14-year-olds who are living in the freest, most prosperous nation in the history of the world. They don't have bombs being dropped over their head, and they're committing suicide and have rates of mental health crisis at record levels. We've got to get to the bottom of that. We have kids that are growing up, not coming out of poverty, coming out of middle class, even upper class homes, who they see somebody being assaulted, and the first thing they do is take a video of it and laugh, not like interfere and say, no, we can't do this. I mean, it's just thing after thing that's happening, and you realize that there's a deep rot going on at the core of our culture because we have destroyed, we have undermined, we have demonized many of the institutions that 5,500 years of human history taught us work. Family is important. Morality is important. We're not going to tell you what faith to belong to, but a faith that teaches you that human life has dignity and that you should respect other people and to care for the poor and the less fortunate and be compassionate and be forgiving and love your neighbor like yourself. These are positive. Why wouldn't we want movements like that influencing our culture and society? And instead, we've demonized them. So there's a lot to unpack there, and much of it is not the work of government, but it certainly sets the tone for some of this. And when government is waging war on those institutions, it makes it harder to cure that disease within the spirit of America. Not easier.
What a perfect answer. It rings like a bell. Senator, thank you so much for your time in this program. Thank you so much for your stalwart defense of American principles and for your vision of this country that so many have seemingly lost. And I think it'll be very inspiring next couple months. And we look forward to seeing you at convention.
Thank you. Good talking.
All right. Godspeed, Senator.